Good morning. Thank you all for joining us this morning after the wonderful first session. This panel is titled Media and Cultural Landscape in Modern Afghanistan. I'm Lior Sternfeld from the History Department and Jewish Studies program here at Penn State, and I'm with the Center for Global Studies. And we have a very interesting panel ahead of us. I'm going to introduce each panelist before they come. The first speaker this morning is Dr. Mejgan Massoumi. Dr. Massoumi is a lecturer and fellow in Civics, Liberal and Global Education at Stanford University. Her work and research explores Afghan engagement with the global communication, technology, the radio, during a period of intense political reform and social transformation, which draws on archives in Farsi, Pashto, Tajik, Urdu, and English. As a scholar and educator and a refugee and immigrant, Massoumi is committed to advancing the culture of equity and inclusion within academia through her activism and advocacy for diversity, as well as her teaching and scholarship focus on the study of history through the experiences of marginalized people, places, and cultures. Massoumi's previous research explores how the dynamics of different forms of religious fundamentalism are produced, represented, and practiced in the city. The culmination of this research can be found in her co-edited book, The Fundamentalist City, Religiosity, and the Remaking of Urban Space, which was published by Routledge in 2010. Her talk this morning is titled Transregional Sonic Past and Transnational Sonic Presence in Afghanistan. Thank you, Dr. Massoumi. The floor is yours.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Sorry, I'm a little vertically challenged, so I hope people can see me over the computer monitor. Thank you so much, Professor Sternfeld, for that introduction. I'd also like to thank Professor McLennan and Professor Ahmadi for convening us today. I also want to thank the Penn Center for Global Studies, and especially Nathan Markowski and Olivia Gearhart for all of their organizational efforts to gather us together. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share a bit of my work and research in this forum, because my approach to understanding Afghanistan's globalism, as well as its history, is through the invocation of listening and really exploring orality as a method to understand the past and perhaps the present. Afghanistan is a land of millions of sounds, yet scholars of Afghanistan's culture and society have largely neglected the vast oral record it contains and have continued to favor texts and images as source material for academic inquiry. If there is a desire to move beyond standard tropes for how we engage and understand this part of the world, we also need to think outside the box in terms of the materials we are using to critique, to discuss, and to offer different views. I'm fortunate to be in a panel with two scholars who have, in their own right, provided or helped to push what I think is a much needed sonic turn in scholarship on Afghanistan that enhances existing work of sociocultural analysis. Professor Ali Karimi's important work on the mediatization of folk music among the Hazara people showcases how the experience of persecution and forced migration transformed the way this community makes music. And my colleague, Ahmad Rashid Salim, works on Persian mystical literature and often references songs and poetry to reread these texts as sites of spiritual exegesis. In this spirit, may we have more projects that helps unsettle and unpack the treasures of sound born out of the diversity that is Afghanistan. I also want to mention how wonderful it is to be in a gathering dedicated specifically to the study of Afghanistan's globalism. You see, many of us have been pushing and knocking at the doors of dominant area studies fields or thematic fields, including global studies, to make the case for our essential inclusion in these spaces. Trying to penetrate them has been best a challenge, and at worst, a complete negation of acknowledgement. Unfortunately, Afghanistan is not the only geography that has been pushed to the margins of various fields, despite its indisputable central and important role in shaping the world and its surrounding regions. One of the terrible fault lines of nationalism is that it has created a general consensus of nationalistic amnesias, where many have forgotten about the exchange, the mobility, and shared culture and humanity that flourished seamlessly between different people and groups. A history rooted in the singularity of the birth of the nation is a history that reduces the complexities of many centuries to a single eternal moment, and isn't history at all. Humanity has always been migratory, but we often forget this in the modern world where borders and boundaries do exist. So while it may seem on the surface that those geographies that are relegated to the margins belong just there, the proof of our world and history unfolding itself has consistently pushed back and shown clear evidence of what a travesty it is to normalize this ignorance. And on that note, what I offer today is a reading of Afghanistan's 20th century, namely the decades of the 1960s and 1970s, through what was heard and what was performed through popular culture. Thinking about globalism in Afghanistan through sound and song presses us to place in context the longer history of exchange and collaboration that existed in the region. When thinking about Afghanistan's impressions in the broader region it encompasses, I am reminded of a deeper past, of the Muslim empires of the 11th and 12th centuries that were based not in Damascus or Baghdad, but in Ghazna and Ghor in present-day Afghanistan, and situated as Indic polities. Some accounts of these cities and the surviving architecture reveal multi-ethnic spaces where artisans and traders and craft communities from Sindh to Samarkand thrived. The rapid rise of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century led to mass migrations to cities across Asia. Indo-Persian literary culture flourished and sustained itself through knowledge brokers who were just as likely to be Brahmin or Cathari as they were Sunni or Shia. Really, from the 14th century onward, we see this growth in vernacular culture as one that combines orality, practice, and daily rituals where various strands of spiritual knowledge made new forms, from the writings of Maulana Jalaluddin Muhammad Balkhi to the poetry of the singer-scholar Amir Khusrau and the ghazals, or the lyrical poems, of Abdul Qadir Bidil. This short list is merely to sketch a literary culture that translated sacral and mystical sentiments into music that was shared among communities across space and time. These names and texts reflect everyday life in living communities where such narratives, stories, and songs found daily practice and were sustenance. Read against this long history compels us then to imagine societies with diverse people, languages, religions, and entangled everyday lives as a reflection of centuries of coexistence and cultural memory. In the time period I study, the 1960s and 70s, we hear the reverberations of these deep-rooted transcultural connections through sonic collaborations broadcast on the radio. A lesser-known yet prevalent example comes from the duet sung between the renowned female Afghan singer, Khanum Jila, and Muhammad Rafi, the famous Indian playback singer for Bollywood films. Together, they sang in Persian. Here's a sampling of one of their songs in Farsi.
ऐ ताजा गुल तू ज़ीनत गुलजार की चिट्ठी ऐ मोरग़े बाग़ दिल तू गिरफ्तार की चिट्ठी ऐ ताजा गुल तू ज़ीनत गुलजार की चिट्ठी ऐ मोरग़े बाग़ दिल तू गिरफ्तार की चिट्ठी गिरफ्तार तू सम गुलजार तू सा गिरफ्तार तू सम
So not many Rafi aficionados know about his collaboration with Khanum Jila. Ay tazagul tu zinat giriftar kisti. The poetry of Barak Shafi conveys the lover's admiration for his beloved, the tazagul, the fresh flower whom he asks, which garden did you come from? And the beloved replies, Ay murghe baghe dil tu giriftar kisti. Oh, the songbird of my heart, who has captured you? To imagine an Indo-Persianate world where cultural comprehension existed despite differences is to remember these collaborations. To imagine a region with porous borders is also to realize the cultural network of poets and texts that stretched from Kabul to Shiraz and from Delhi to Samarkand. So what enabled these collaborations in pop culture to happen during this time period, and why are they significant? We began in 1964 with a new constitution enacted under King Zahir Shah, which would allow for a more open society that coincided with the modernizing agenda that characterized his period of rule. Relaxed restraints on the government's control of the press, speech, and self-expression allowed for the expression of social, cultural, and political dissent. These developments coincided with the ongoing Afghan non-alignment stance between the two superpowers at the time, the United States and the Soviet Union, although Afghans were certainly open to aid and development from both sides, as is evidenced by the many infrastructure projects that were funded by the Russians and the Americans. So amid these developments, Afghans improved their communication networks with advancements in telephone and telegram systems, as well as postal and radio services. This is an advertisement you see for Sony radios in Juandun magazine, a pop culture magazine of the time. And the slogan reads, Sony baraye man, Sony baraye shama, Sony baraye hama. Sony for me, Sony for you, Sony for all. The radio played a pivotal role in serving as a base to the growth in mass culture and in extending the reach of Afghans throughout the world with daily programs in several languages, including Urdu, Hindi, English, Russian, and French. Now, what I attempt to show through my work are the ways in which the modern technology of the radio functioned as a site where significant patterns of contemporary movement, regional exchange, and connectivity intersected. It also served as a platform in which Afghans showcased their cosmopolitan sensibilities and actively engaged in global currents. Radio broadcasting was of crucial importance for communicating with the public within and beyond Afghanistan. In a largely illiterate society, this technology became the vehicle for dialogue with the public and for the public to engage with the social, cultural, and political happenings of their milieus. So, developments in radio technology and the expansion of the recording studios in Afghanistan. What originally started out as Radio Kabul permeated from the capital city in the early 1920s as a state-run enterprise under King Amanullah Khan. But it wasn't really until the 1960s that it would reach the whole of the country and beyond. Under the government of King Zahir Shah and Prime Minister Mohammad Dawood Khan, the radio expanded to reach, and with the help of German technicians and Siemens transmitters, its programming would become available to the entire country and to far-reaching places, including Japan and South Africa. In 1964, with the construction of 7 recording studios, 2 concert studios, and a large auditorium, the Ministry of Information and Culture put the national stamp on the radio and officially recognized it as Radio Afghanistan. It also became the center for the patronage and the promotion of new popular music that was suitable for radio broadcasting. Now, globally, this time period, the 60s and 70s, was particularly important for the development of the circulation of sound. The advent of the tape recorder and a magnetic tape that allowed for cassette recording was quite revolutionary. Tape recorders meant that now sound was very easy to export in and out of the country and enabled these transnational connections of music in particular to flourish. With regard to radio broadcasting, it allowed producers to pre-record programs, create records, and distribute sound much more seamlessly than before, without all of the sort of static and background noise that one typically gets with live recordings. Moreover, with the introduction of battery-powered transistor radios in the 1960s, even some of the most remote villages and areas began to listen to radio. Tape recorders and cassette players were now wireless, and you could find people at public gatherings, at milaz, and concerts with their tape recorders in hand and informally recording at these functions. Cassettes also played a critical and an important role in transporting Afghan music beyond its borders and bringing new sounds from elsewhere to the Afghans. In Tajikistan, the radio and cassettes were instrumental in introducing listeners to Afghan musicians. Mehri-Niso Bobabakova, a Tajiki poet and member of the parliament, recalls how in the 1970s, that many young Afghans who came to Tajikistan to pursue university degrees brought with them cassettes of Afghan music, both formally and informally recorded, and shared them with their Tajik colleagues. Mehri-Niso describes how she obtained a cassette from an Afghan friend and became introduced to Ahmad Zoyer, an Afghan icon of pop music who, as we will learn later, expanded his influence throughout the region. So Afghans and Tajiks were interested in sharing and learning from one another through sonic experiences in which their lingua franca, Farsi, served as a common denominator. In addition to the example of Tajikistan, in the 1970s, a number of musicians went on tour throughout Iran at the invitation of King Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi and performed in concerts and musical gatherings, often with Iranian musicians, composers, and poets present. Iranian musicians also came to Afghanistan and held concerts and popularized their music among urban Kabulites. An example of this exchange is with the famed Iranian pop star, Faiqa Atishin, or better known as Gogosh, whose hit song, Man Amadam, I Have Arrived, is an adaptation of an Afghan folk song and was presented to her as a gift from the Afghan singer, songwriter, and composer, Ustad Jalil Zaland. Here, it's important to note the regional popularity of what became known as the Kabuli Ghazal, again, meaning lyric poems. In musical terms, the Kabuli Ghazal style is related to Ghazal singing in India and Pakistan, but the setting of the text to music is distinctly Afghan, with interpolated couplets sung in free rhythm, fast instrumental sections, and dramatic rhythmic cadences. In his book, War, Exile, and Music in Afghanistan, the ethnomusicologist John Bailey details the formation of the Kabuli Ghazal in the musical quarters of the Koche Kharabat in Kabul in the 1940s, and how it was exported throughout the region to Iran, to Tajikistan, to India, and so forth, where it was borrowed and used to propel Persianate music forward, yet seldom has there been given proper credit as belonging to the masters of Kharabat and Kabul. Nonetheless, the songs played on the radio reflected an assortment of influence from the melodies of the Kabuli Ghazal to the beats and rhythms of Bollywood music, and from the funk of Iranian pop and the nearly global appeal of other international stars like Enrico Macias, Kulthum, and Johnny Cash, among countless others. In Afghan society, the arts embodied a unique form of cultural expression and a possible space for autonomy. Artistic practices are also fertile ground for expressions of dissent and social criticism. Music, in particular, played a significant role for relaying social critiques and to broach taboo subjects, often through playful, innocent-sounding folk songs. To illustrate this point, I now turn to Ahmad Zoyer, one of the most popular musical icons of Afghanistan to date. Ahmad Zoyer was the son of a court doctor and minister of health, and his privileged background and position enabled him to move both between the Afghan elite and mingle with influential foreigners, interactions that alerted him to the pop music coming out from all over the world. And he used this to advance not only his repertoire, but what Afghanistan's pop music would become. Having traveled widely, becoming exposed to the burgeoning musical revolution of the 1960s in Europe and America, as well as South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, these varied musical influences led him to forge an entirely different musical style that mixed regional sounds with international ones. He collaborated with popular musicians and poets from the region, including Forough Farrokhzad and Simine Behbahani, feminist poets from Iran, and others throughout the broader region. He borrowed from the Persian world's classic poets, including Maulana, Beidil, Sadi, and Hafiz. He used compositions and melodies from the likes of Enrico Macias and the Beatles. His unconventional music also became emblematic of the internal deliberations Afghans were having with various social and cultural issues brought on by society's changing attitudes towards sex and gender relations, tyrannical politics, identity, poverty, and issues concerning social justice. So I'll turn to an example to illustrate this point. In the late 1970s, Ahmad Zoyer sang one of his most popular songs, Zindagi Akhir Sarayat, Life Will Eventually End. So just to place some context here, in the late 70s, we are in Afghanistan with a regime of rule inspired by their own interpretations of socialism and communism. And they were also fiercely oppressive against those who showed any kind of political dissent to their establishment. At the time, Zoyer's relations with the new government were increasingly hostile, mainly due to his refusal to publicly support the regime. His songs were increasingly censored from Radio Afghanistan, particularly as they began to take on a more political undertone. So with this particular song, he cleverly subverts the system. The song lyrics of Zindagi Akhir Sarayat belong to the famous communist poet Abdul Qasim al-Lahuti. The chorus translates to, life will eventually end, there's no need for submission. If submission was mandatory, there'd be no reason to live. And later in the song, he sings, life for a human being is his freedom and independence. Fight for your freedom, for there is no reason for submission. And here's a sampling of what that sounded like. Reflect back on Zoher's archive of sound because it helps us contextualize the global pop culture moment in Afghanistan. And yet I listened to these words 47 years later, and 2023 and feel they resonate as deeply as they did back then. One of my favorite albums is his collaboration with the Afghan boy band Sitaraha, or the Stars as they were known. So they produced this album in the late 1970s, just a few years before the coup by Nur Muhammad Taraki. And one of the songs on the album was quite prophetic, capturing the changing political atmosphere. And the chorus is, Chi shud ki rekht o baham baz ashiyaneh ma, ze ham du sekht o chara tar pude khaneh ma. And that roughly translates to, what happened that ruined our home? What unraveled the fabric of our nest? And the rest of the song continues, do you not feel sorry that you caused this? Our nest blew in a wind of fire. Don't seek to harass us for fear. Let the breeze send our nightly cries to the world. And here's a clip of that.
چه شد که ریخت و هم باز آشیانه ما ز هم دو سیخت و چرا تارا بود خانه ما چه شد که ریخت و هم باز آشیانه ما.
Sorry, pardon me. So very quickly in conclusion, as we witness today in Afghanistan another social and political experiment taking place, I get asked a lot, what's going to be the place of music within this new imposed structure in place? And I think we must ask, who gets to decide what is this so-called indigenous culture of Afghanistan is? If certain practices and modes of relation have existed for centuries, even beyond the formal making of Afghanistan's modern borders, how then do you negate a past filled with sounds and language and pretend, if you will, that it never existed or that it wasn't something authentic to this region or the people? How do we contend with those who insist on imposing yet another interpretation of what is tradition and claiming that as the true representation of culture? In fact, tradition is nothing more than what we make and sustain every day and everywhere through the contemptuous act of living. Music is too precious, it's too old to quickly be forgotten and swept under the rug. Regardless of the regimes of rule, Afghans will continue to sing Yaki Burimba Mazar Mullah Muhammad Jan or Laili Laili Jan Dilma Kardi Wairan, among many others that have sustained through oral traditions. These are folk songs that have existed and persisted on and through this land for as many years that surpass many of us. These songs carry with them part of the history of humanity. Kabul and his residents were not only receivers of globalization, modern technology, media, consumer culture, or government repression. They also acted in contradictory ways, articulating forms of subjectivity and agency, and moved within, through, and against state institutions and political structures. Indeed, Afghan identities are contingent, internally contested, fragmented, and capable of multiple possibilities. As a mode of social relation in 20th century Afghanistan, the radio articulated new senses of Afghan identities that were inextricable from global dialogues. The ways in which Afghans appropriated and imbued the radio with local meanings and global inspirations reflected a way of being in the world that was not only cognizant of larger trends, but made them relevant to the Afghan social environment. Indeed, listening to the past produces a very different history than simply reading about the past. By coming to our senses, then, we have learned something more about the story of the evolution of Afghanistan itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mejgan. Our next speaker is Dr. Ali Karimi. Dr. Karimi is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication, Media and Film at the University of Calgary. He is a scholar of critical information studies with focus on surveillance, privacy, and data justice. Karimi's current research examines the power politics of how the state produces, organizes, and uses population information. He studies this problem mostly in the context of the weak states in the global South, where data is often contested and information injustice is a major issue, a problem that particularly hurts marginalized groups. He is currently working on a book project tentatively titled The State of Opacity, a history of counting people, places, and prices in Afghanistan, that tells the story of 3 artifacts that are used for tracking people, places, and prices: the identification document, the house number, and the price tag. The book shows how numerical information, or lack thereof, can affect the state, society, and the market at large. Dr. Karimi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lior. And of course, thank you to Professors Sophia McLennan, Ali Ahmadi, and the colleagues from Center for Global Studies for putting this conference together. It is an honor to be here. My talk today is about the spy balloon, not the Chinese one, but the American one. The blimps that were stationed in Afghanistan. Many people have been trying to figure out what went wrong in Afghanistan, including Ambassador Rahmani yesterday, and how the Afghan government could not hold it together even one afternoon without the Americans. In my research, I have been looking at the history of information in Afghanistan to explain the chronic weakness of the Afghan state. This is based on a simple premise. You cannot govern a population or a territory if you do not know it. I use the word governance to mean the delivery of public services, including justice and security. What you know and how you know it determines the limits of your governance. The surveillance blimps that the US deployed in Afghanistan are great examples of how governance was practiced in the past 2 decades in the country. This was a government from above. In this paper, I wish to make 2 points. First, the surveillance blimp violated the privacy of the surveilled and undermined the sovereignty of the country. The blimp, a war machine, operated in Afghanistan with little accountability, and the harms that it caused were not well known. The second point I'll try to make is that the blimps are a representation of what could be called the remote state. They are hardware of vertical governance. The state uses them to exercise its power from a safe distance in the air, in places where it lacks either authority or legitimacy on the land. In a recent interview, Mick Ryan, an Australian general who served in Afghanistan as part of the NATO mission, said you could put forward a thesis that Afghanistan was the most densely surveilled battle space in the history of humankind. That was a quote. He is probably right. Afghanistan was the first major 21st century war. Americans had made great progress in new communication technologies, and they were eager to deploy them in a real battlefield. From land and air, all sorts of surveillance tech such as blimps, drones, biometric identification tech, telecom interception, and other forms of mass surveillance were deployed in Afghanistan. Still, I would argue that the US and the Afghan state did not know the country. A great part of this surveillance effort was aerial. The blimp was part of the arsenal of air power technologies that the US military used to establish aerial control of the territory. The blimp can help us understand how vertical governance operated in the country. Blimps are high-tech static balloons stationed in the air to provide persistent visual data about the geography and the population underneath. Their long endurance in the air makes them, in some instances, more effective surveillance tools than the average drone. Blimps go by different names and acronyms in the military, but mostly they are known as Persistent Ground Surveillance Systems, or PGSS, pronounced PGS. The US first used them in Iraq in 2004, and then they were introduced in Afghanistan in 2007. When they became very popular. At one point, there were 66 surveillance blimps stationed across Afghanistan. After the last year's fall of the Afghan government and the withdrawal of US troops, there is none. Blimps are filled with helium gas, which is lighter than air. They are unmanned and do not drop bombs or fly around, but stay in the same spot in the air for up to 30 days at a time and stare down on dense population centers or contested spaces. Some blimps are tethered to a ground anchor and some are not. The more advanced high-altitude ones are not tethered to the ground and can fly 70,000 feet in the air. American commanders loved them for being cheaper than drones and better at surveillance. They provided a perpetual full-color view of important spots in urban and rural areas, helping them look for, identify, and track targeted individuals. I borrow the concept of vertical governance from public policy, where it is used as a metaphor for top-down way of managing people and making decisions. In employing vertical governance in this context, in the context of population surveillance, I intend to highlight the main conclusion that I draw from my discussion. Verticality is the defining feature of state governance in contested spaces in weak states, such as conflict zones like Afghanistan. This is why the blimp was used not only by the US in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also used by China on South China Sea, and Israel in East Jerusalem, and Turkey on the Syrian border. The state uses the blimp, as I mentioned earlier, in places where it lacks legitimacy on the ground or its legitimacy is contested, and therefore can only manage the territory from a safe distance in the sky. Taking a medio-archaeological view of the blimp, we can trace its history to the early days of aeromobility. The first flying object was an 18th century balloon that a Frenchman built to use as a watch post. In other words, it was not the desire for air travel that drove innovators to build an aerial machine, but the desire for a stationary aerial surveillance technology. Those hot air observation posts were first used for scientific research in areas such as topography and weather forecast, but soon became military technologies. In 1794, the French army flew the first surveillance balloon during the Battle of Villeneuve in the Netherlands that they eventually won. In the 19th century, during the US Civil War, the Union Army had a ballooning unit that helped it collect critical battlefield information. We can extend the history of the blimp even further back, connecting it to the watchtowers of the ancient world. The watchtowers, as we have learned from John Durham Peters, historian, were quote unquote the fundamental media of surveillance. They were the first technology that offered a view from the high ground. In Afghanistan, airplanes, air bombardments, and air surveillance all came at once. Afghanistan first encountered aerial technology during a military confrontation, the Third Anglo-Afghan War in the summer of 1919. The war ended quickly in 1 month, probably thanks to the air supremacy of the British. It was the first time Afghans were seeing airplanes, let alone airplanes that shot at them. The Royal Air Force bombarded Kabul and Jalalabad. In Kabul, the women of the harem rushed outside when a bomb hit near the palace. On the front lines, the Afghan fighters were traumatized by the aerial killing machine. They fled in panic. They were so scared, according to one veteran, that the sight of a big bird in the sky would make them seek shelter under a rock. This was what the British wanted, to demoralize the Afghans. These aspects of the war was widely covered by Western press. Yeah, a second aspect of early air power was surveillance and reconnaissance. The planes, in addition to dropping bombs, would also take photos from strategic places. This is a photo from the Third Anglo-Afghan War. They now could see the territory and the population from a dominant angle. Well after the war, the British planes would carry out this type of data collection missions in Afghanistan. Sometimes the locals would shoot at them, as reported in newspapers. In 1920, as we see in this picture, a Royal Air Force plane had to land in Katawaz, eastern Afghanistan, and was captured by the Afghans. Afghanistan, what one could say, has been a long-time battleground for aerial surveillance from the early days of aero mobility. Although sharing a history with the 18th century military balloons, the modern blimps have little in common with those early aero stations when it comes to surveillance capabilities. The blimps deployed in Afghanistan could watch and listen to vast geographical areas and provide a live feed of everything in HD video. They were equipped with infrared cameras and monitored people even in the dark of the night. The US military had no restrictions in using the balloons, mainly because they did not shoot, and that meant that they received little attention from the media when compared to the drones. The blimp, as I said, is an instrument of vertical governance for states that have difficulty exercising their authority on the land. Afghanistan's former government was such a state. Together with the US and other NATO forces, it controlled only 30% of the country. The remaining 70% were all contested spaces where insurgents like the Taliban and ISIS had a strong presence. In those places, the state was governing the population remotely, and that often meant vertically. The American blimps across the country collected so much video content that the military found it humanly impossible to process them. In 2018, the Pentagon first tried to get Google to train an artificial intelligence program to watch the videos and identify potential targets. That contract, known as Project Maven, was canceled after thousands of Google employees walked out in protest. Some years later, the Pentagon found another Silicon Valley company that agreed to do the job. The new company was Palantir Technologies, a surveillance corporation that processed the data blimps collected in Afghanistan. The company's founder and chairperson is this man, Peter Thiel, the controversial billionaire that most of you are familiar with because he is also involved in Silicon Valley Bank collapse. The man is a real-life cartoon villain. Every blimp in Afghanistan carried several cameras for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance purposes. According to a PJSS operator who spoke to journalist Annie Jacobson, whose book First Platoon is partly about the US blimps in Afghanistan, the camera feed was live streamed to several monitors on the ground. Separately, the data went to Palantir's database for processing. Palantir's software shifted through the data and offered an algorithmic pattern recognition that were important in identifying targets. In one occasion, the software recommended a man as a target. The reason, the man was wearing a purple hat. And purple hat, according to the algorithm, were not common in that part of Kandahar. PJSS operators spent weeks following every moment of that man's life. They were very close to ordering his execution, but at the last minute, the operator decided to call it off. He was later proved right, because the man was just a farmer with a purple hat and had nothing to do with insurgents. People in Afghanistan initially had no idea what these giant balloons were that mysteriously appeared in their skies. In 2009, a blogger, Asad Bouda, wrote a speculative and poetic piece about it, mockingly calling the giant balloon, quote unquote, the balloon of democracy. He wrote, quote, "The empty belly of this hollow bird that has appeared like a monster over Kabul will never get full. This balloon is the sleazy and insatiable and at the same time anxious eye of the power," unquote. His gut feeling about the surveillance function of the blimp was correct. The blimp looked at the Afghan private spaces that no strangers had seen before, the courtyard. Afghan houses have surrounding walls for privacy and protection reasons. Inside courtyard is considered a private space. This concept was alien to the blimp and blimp operators who watched over people day and night, violating the Afghan sense of privacy. The blimp, as we learned from operators, could see people's most private moments, including when they went to the bathrooms and when they prayed. What happened, one would ask, if insurgents shot at the balloon? Mostly nothing. You could shoot at the balloon and it would stay in the air. Only heavy shooting could bring them down, and that rarely happened. As one US Army colonel explained, quote, "We actually like people shooting at the blimp. When they start shooting at it, it tells us where they are," unquote. While initially mysterious and scary, in later years, people submitted to the American blimps out of helplessness. In one occasion, even an Afghan villager stopped American soldiers and asked them if they knew who stole his goat, because he said, quote, "I knew you are watching us from above." A terrifying feature about the blimp and the way it violates personal privacy is its permanence. It keeps watching you and follows your behavior everywhere at all times. Many of the surveillance tools that we are used to, like our phones, are in our control. Sometimes we even consent to share our data. We can turn our devices off. We even have some control over public surveillance devices like CCTVs. They have a narrow field of vision and limited capacity. In the case of blimp, you have no choice and no escape. You never consented to this type of surveillance, and you have no idea who is watching you and how your data is being processed and stored. It mentally weighs on you to carry the constant feeling of being watched by somebody in the air and every moment of your life being recorded. The blimp, as a result, could serve as a metaphor for the post-2001 state building project in Afghanistan. A state that is there, but it is not there. It can see you, but can't help you, and you can never reach it because it is too far away. The blimp is embodiment of the remote state. It is easy to say the US military could not control the country. It is true if you look at the land. However, looking at the aerial territory tells a different story. The US had full territorial sovereignty over Afghanistan. This is best evident in how it controlled the Afghan airspace. In the past 2 decades, all air traffic controls in the country were managed by Americans. They did not trust Afghans. This distrust was to the extent that Americans kept the keys to the lockers where Afghan Air Force pilots kept their helmets. Every morning after Americans approved a mission, they would give them their helmets. On August 15, 2001, the infamous day that the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani fled the country on 3 helicopters to Uzbekistan, according to one of his aides, his biggest worry was not the Taliban, but getting shot at by Americans who were still in charge of the Afghan airspace. This was why they had to fly low, hoping to avoid radar detection. In 28 June 2022, residents of Nagulas, a border town about 20,000 population in Arizona, woke up to a scene you only saw in Afghanistan in recent years. A giant white balloon hovering over the town. It is a surveillance blimp conducting round-the-clock ground surveillance for US Customs and Border Patrol. If history is any guide, we will see more blimps like this on American soil in the future. Most surveillance technologies were first tested in colonial settings. Later, they become routine instruments of governance at home. Fingerprinting is one that was invented in India and then became a ubiquitous governmental technology. In conclusion, let's revisit the early balloons of the 18th century. They created a new mode of territorial perception and inspired the modern state's non-stop pursuit of a synoptic view of the population and the geography. The high-tech surveillance blimps of today, although tied to this long history, are a different breed of vertical instruments of power and violence. The early balloons were military hardware used only in the battlefields. When the war stopped, they were no longer in use. The blimps of today, however, crosses the boundaries of war and peace and puts the surveilled population in a state of perpetual war, a condition where laws are suspended, rights are ignored, and everyone is treated as a potential target. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ali. And our last panelist this morning is Ahmed Rashid Salim. Ahmed Rashid Salim is a doctoral fellow at the University of California, Berkeley. His research interests include Persian mystical literature and its epistemologies of Islam. He studies the history, culture, and literature of modern Afghanistan and looks to interrogate and complicate prevalent notions around literacy, independence, peripheries of language, and imagined past in the Persianate world. He is the author of the best-selling book, Islam Explained, published by Rockridge Press. And his talk this morning is Tongue-Tied and Heart-Bound, The Lines of Language, Literature, and Religion in the Resistance. Rashid, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning. How's everyone doing today? Hopefully you got your 2 cups of coffee. Thank you for your time and your presence today, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation and all of the folks working behind the scenes and front stage. And also thank you to my co-panelists for their very wonderful and illuminating talks. I will save some trees today and read off of my laptop. And I think the amount of time that I've been granted is 53 minutes. So I hope you're all okay and ready to get the show started. Since August of 2021, there have been crystallizations of a clearly indigenous and informed resistance movement against the Taliban in Afghanistan. Indigenous includes, among other factors, the presence of fighters from within the territorial confines of the country and not exported nor imported by various cross-regional extremist groups. The usage of informed highlights a non-reactionary and cogent vision and viability of short and long-term realities and possibilities of the country, reflective of its diverse and divergent delineations. This resistance is both inside and outside of the country with a multi-dimensional and distinct approach to confronting and resisting the Taliban and their draconian and oppressive chokehold on the country. This presentation posits that the points of departure since August are a more vivid and vociferous centering of religiously informed refutations of the Taliban and Persian or Farsi literature. This centering of Farsi unfolds in a number of traditional and newly informed ways. A more vocal recognition and centering of historical attempts to displace, deter, and deform the language and its natural place and proliferation within the country, as well as to sever the cultural and intellectual ties with peoples outside of the boundaries of the modern country of Afghanistan. This, of course, not limited to the arbitrary change of the name of the language by the government in 1964. Further, an insistence on reviving and recentering classical texts and thinkers as paragons of possibilities and purveyors of perennial wisdom, seeing this as a natural continuum of the huwiyat of the people. This term, huwiyat, though currently translated to mean identity, has a number of relevant past histories. We should bear in mind that the term has a clear philosophical and spiritual psychological rootedness linked to the pursuit of determining and displaying an essence and an intellectual reality. Thus, attempts to place huwiyat at the forefront is not simply a sociological nor a political act, but is directly and indirectly linked to a scholarly, philosophical, and metaphysical cosmology, broadening the current conditions to not simply a time before the present, but also beyond it. Moreover, it invests in and contributes toward wider global conversations and contestations, shifting the local to the global stage, and the contents and discontents of the global summarized at the micro level. The most prominent resistance group against the Taliban is the National Resistance Front, NRF, led by Ahmad Massoud. This group is composed of former National Defense and Security Forces, ANDSF, and other volunteer members. The reinvestment of individuals immediately within and outside of the NRF to the classical canon of Persian literature is of significance, for it elucidates a number of relevant points in the understanding and definitions of resistance literature. Before I proceed, I want to recognize I want to recognize that even in the previous resistance movements against the communist government in Afghanistan and against the first period of the Taliban regime, poetry was, of course, part of the soundscape of the Mujahideen literature. However, the point that I'm positing here is that the distinction is that it was not centered as a point of primary protection and power. This is the shift that's happening now. That was wholly reserved for Islam and defeating the godless communists, to quote. In this literature, in this iteration of the resistance, language and literature are among the areas of intentional and prioritized engagement to mark a clear distinction and difference from the Taliban, and by extension, according to some, Pashtun hegemony over political and linguistic shifts in the country. Moreover, the engagement is not simply a nostalgic reach onto a foregone past. Rather, it is intended to pull the text and its taxonomies into the present, as well as to generate new literature and language. The utilization of poetry in literature is not confined to the classical period. In fact, multiple poets and poems are prominent in the discourse and involve modern poets such as Wasif Bakhtari, Qahar Asi, and Najib Barwar, to name a few. Multiple segments of the National Resistance Front have centered literature as a focal gathering point of value and validation of the resistance efforts and aims. This has occurred both in the usage of poems from the canon of Persian literature, the production of poetry, as well as poetry readings. In fact, it was following one such reading involving the Shahnama al-Firdausi that led to locating and an eventual battle with one of the most recognized and celebrated commanders of the NRF, Khair Muhammad Khair Kha, alongside his regiment in Andarab. In addition, we see the usage of names and terms that are popular in the Shahnama to refer to fighters and commanders and others. These efforts are part of a revival and reclaiming of traditions deemed to be central to the identity and identification of the Persian or Farsi speakers of Afghanistan and the land's contribution to the heritage of the Persianate and Islamic worlds. They also include attempts by various generations in the diaspora to integrate with and revive language and its literature as a process of resistance and recovery. Indeed, these texts are read and received as an emic in-group engagement and worldview, not literature that is Edic nor foreign. In the process, there is an attempt to relocate the self as a member of a global community situated in the present, pertinent and concurrent with the order and flow of organizing around and relating to the modern world. Keeping this point in mind will help us connect the lines and threads that unify these various links throughout this brief presentation. Further, it attempts to realign with the fortification of a Khorasani interpretation of Islam, both in theology and mysticism, which seems less foreign and fanatical than the Deobandi-bound bearings of the Taliban and similar interpretations. The NRF has been successful in highlighting a differentiation and stark contrast between their vision and interpretive approach, values, and the views of the Taliban and similar outfits. Among the points insisted upon is that the resistance's readings and interpretations of Islam are not only rooted within the tradition, thus unequivocally rejecting the Taliban's postures and pushing back against one of the Taliban's main weapons, which is that they are the true representatives of Islam. The resistance has insisted that, in fact, their interpretation of Islam, not the Taliban's, is not only balanced and avoids extremes, but further that it uniquely incorporates the on-the-ground realities of the country for all peoples, not just native Persian speakers. This is important to highlight because the resistance does not see itself as representing nor fighting only for a particular group. This is clearly indicated in the formal interviews, announcements, presentations, and postures of the group. By affirming that the majority of the population is in fact Muslim, they highlight two further points. First, that there are various interpretive realities related to Islam. This diversity of views, however, categorically denies a place for extremist and violent tendencies represented by the Taliban and similar groups. The reference to multiple interpretive realities incorporates not just Sunni schools of interpretation within Islam, but also Shi'i schools of interpretation, Shiite and Sunni as some say. Moreover, there is not an insistence on inquisition into the actual commitments and practices of the general citizenry. It thus aligns with the classical interpretive demarcation of banning curiosity and critique of what occurs in the private realm, by extension, removing the enforcement via violent insistence of religiosity upon the public. Perusing speeches and announcements from the National Resistance Front, videos from resistance fighters, civil protesters, social media circles and posts, and the burgeoning of digital programs since August of 2021, I offered that these attempts usher a reformation of the centrality of language and religion in Afghanistan and are crucial to understanding the vision and viability of what the future holds for both Afghanistan and the global community. These imprints offer an insistence and the possibility of institutionalizing the most dramatic intellectual shifts in Afghanistan that could obviate the repeat of an abrupt severance of a legitimate political rule and authority and becoming a breeding ground for terrorist groups and extremism. The country of Afghanistan has haphazardly been bordered and perennial attempts to uniformly institutionalize the Pashto language, just one of the many languages and dialects spoken by the various ethnic and social groups within the country, have not yielded the desired nor the envisioned standardization. However, the various systemic attempts to center Pashto have led to preventions, perversions, and erasures of various other languages in the country, such as Uzbek and Persian, for example. The latter has served as a lingua franca and contact language for not only the geographical land now known as Afghanistan, but also indeed a much larger terrestrial terrain. During the more than a millennium of literary and scholarly production in Persian, multiple traditions and tenors have manifested, from the political and administrative to the poetic and spiritual. Mejgan referred to sort of the Mughal period, where we see a very syncretic formation and utilization of Persian that incorporates various religious and groups, something that very much differs from Sanskrit, which was pretty much insisted upon as being an esoteric and sort of particular realm. How are we doing on time? I think I have 47 minutes left. That was just 6 minutes, right? Yeah, okay, we're good.
20 minutes left.
Okay, that's good. Yes, within the spiritual and mystical realm, unique and sophisticated interpretations of the Islamic religious tradition have been developed by speakers and seekers relating to or at home with the language, particularly in the realm of theology, law, mysticism, and the interpretive or tafsiri tradition. This interpretive tradition is also referred to as the Khorasani interpretive tradition. This religious and literary tradition is both impressed and imaginally vibrant. And the term imaginal here refers more to the classical Akbarian or Ibn Arabi school of mystical philosophy, which looks at the imagination not as some sort of illusory or fanciful occurrence, but one that is rooted in knowledge, one that is a site, a liminal space where both conceptual and practical components are molded and unionized, or unified rather. So this religious and literary tradition is both impressed and imaginally vibrant, marked by an involved and introspective reading and rereadings of the Islamic tradition, both religious and non-religious, that centers socio-political justice, social pragmatism, and the permeation of a mystical and Gnostic proclivity best represented in the literary tradition of the language. Historically, what allowed for such a blossoming is an amalgam of means, movements, and materials that saw the language and its literature as open to engagement, irrespective of background and status. The presence of a large cadre of skilled men of letters able to dispense bureaucratic and political functions, the identification of Persian as a prestige language, the movement of Sufi masters, and importantly, the circulation and reception of literary texts. These facets had an important linking thread, the incorporation of a uniquely syncretic tradition that allows for pluralism in a society in ways that other traditions do not allow for. With this in mind, clear delineations appear in the worldview and cosmology of the resistance that attempts to link the tongue and the heart in the context of political participation and rights. All individuals, according to them, of the country, irrespective of gender, geographic location, ethnicity, and religious beliefs, are to be included and incorporated in a political system that centers free elections, equity, independence, receptivity to change in all of these various categories, peace, adherence to international norms, and reform. There are to be no legal preventative barriers or preventive barriers to female participation in all segments of the political, social, and economic formations within the country. Access to education and curriculum reform that combats extremism and parochialism, as well as one that aligns the country with the social and scientific developments of the day, are centered and prioritized. Framing and recognizing the country as religious and ethnically plural with a vision of citizenship and civil rights, the NRF is the most viable movement, I argue, for the actualization of a stabilized, and this is a key point here, the actualization of a stabilized interpretive reformation of Islam in Afghanistan. And the point reformation, especially speaking of it in a Western context, has much baggage associated to it. My point here is not an insistence that Islam as a religion can be reformed, the same way that it occurred with Christianity, for example, but that there is a reinterpretive reformation that can happen. So a return to the canon, a return to the sources, a rereading that will develop and generate new possibilities and new imaginative approaches to texts that are present and very much rooted within these lands and these peoples, irrespective of the varying levels of commitments and piety. Although everyone, of course, doesn't eat pork, because that's an important thing, right? Framing and recognizing the country as religious and ethnically plural with a vision of citizenship and civil rights, as I mentioned, and civic rights. The NRF is the most viable movement for the actualization of a stabilized interpretive reformation of Islam in Afghanistan and the wider region. We need to remember that Afghanistan is not sort of this dislocated and severed place. It has a very rich, this country now named Afghanistan, has a very rich tradition of scholarship and literary and philosophical and other productions that can once again be revisited and rekindled with returning to such canons. This is possible by the seriousness of the NRF's approach in embracing and recognizing not only the realities within Afghanistan, but also globally, and that extremism and a proclivity toward unhinged violence in the name of religion have decimated much of the country and region. The presence of scholars within the ranks of the NRF, as well as those serving in consultative roles, present a unique scenario wherein scholars with training and conversance in the traditional sciences of Islam have also had close study of global religious and intellectual movements, and many have spent time living in the West or in more vibrant centers of religious debate. This exposure to alternatives and living in pluralistic societies is of tremendous importance and aids to broaden perceptions and conceptions of what is tenable and tenuous. Moreover, the presence of scholars from both Shi'i and Sunni interpretive traditions of Islam within the NRF can have long-lasting shifts on Shi'i-Sunni relations and polemics nationally and internationally. There is a greater insistence on dialogue and debate, countering dogmatism, revisiting systematized views, particularly in the realm of traditions, ahadith, and reframing the possibilities of a reflective, meditative Islam as a force for greater stability and equity within the country. I should mention that the key difference in marking such endeavors as viable or vexed is the rootedness in the tradition, allowing for more sophisticated engagements with the intellectual and religious tradition that moves beyond generalizations and platitudes. Moreover, recognizing the need for qualified specialists who are not religiously trained to lead various economic, political, and social sectors. This view also recognizes a distinction between the political rule of the scholarly class and the facticity of the scholarly class as a social and organizational force. The proposal for an honest and critical reading of the past to arrive at the present and propose particular futures is applied both to religious texts and the recent history of the country. The platform and position of the resistance can have both unique shifts in the way religion and language are engaged with, incorporated and revitalized in the country, and much more. Referring to commanders, as I noted, by various in spiritually and literary inspired themes, the formation, for example, of a women's council recently. There's many examples that we can engage with in the question and answer session or outside of the time allotted here. These are just a few aspects of this engagement. The full range and realization is yet to fully materialize. I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for finishing 30 minutes before your time was up.
Oh, that was round one. I'm going to take a break and I'm going to come back.
I want to thank the three presenters for really rich and illuminating presentations. And now we have about 25 minutes for Q&A. Open the floor. Marjan.
Thank you all so much for these really wonderful contributions. My question, I have multiple questions for all of you, but right now I'm going to address my question for Professor Karimi. Alijan, thank you so much. That was such a fascinating paper, so incredibly rich. And it reminded me of essentially what social historians do, right? Picking this small thing and then using that sort of as a prism through which you refract all these other wonderful layers and aspects. And it was really rich, and I have so many questions for you. But I think one of the things that also reminded me of was sort of Foucault's panopticon. And I just wanted to invite you, if you could tell us a little bit more about sort of what that means in terms of disciplining the bodies, right? This is a sort of a two-way process, right? There is sort of a camera, but it also sort of instills a certain kind of discipline on the bodies that are seeing this on the ground. What I'm essentially asking, is there instances, do you know anything about how sort of people on the ground change their behaviors because there's essentially a blimp watching them?
Thank you very much, Marjan, for that amazing question. So in studying how the blimp, also the drone, have affected people, you notice that especially in mostly contested spaces in southern and eastern Afghanistan, the Pashtun provinces, where this surveillance technology were most active. It initially people were very scared of it, but then what appeared was this process of self-governance, or what's a Foucauldian term. Self-governance means that initially an actual person have to discipline you, and then that person is not there, but that machine, that representation disciplines your behavior, like the traffic lights. There's no person there, just the lights is disciplining our behavior on the road. So people on the ground, they learn to adapt to this new reality. They especially young people, they call the drone bizbizak. I don't know what word they had for the blimp, but they did things that would not be picked up by the blimp. So they gained a different view of privacy and private life. And this, of course, was mostly in rural areas where the presence of the blimp is very, very profound. But in the urban areas like Kabul, people just out of helplessness just submitted to it and lived their life without caring much about it. But one thing I didn't mention was that one of the feeds, video feeds from the blimp was also shared with the Afghan Ministry of Interior. So it was used for actual policing. If they wanted to chase a car, they would use that feed that the Americans shared with them. So it affected people's behavior a lot, and it is one of the technologies of self-governance. So, but it was not very, if you look at the general view of the whole country, it was not very effective technologies for producing security. So people's lives were not safer. People didn't feel safer because of these technologies, although they were sold as technologies of security. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
If I may just related to the question that Mejgan
Wally.
just related to the question that you asked, I think mostly we think of confrontations, battles, wars taking place on a horizontal kind of spatial basis. But here we have this vertical thing, and I think it really changes the entire dynamics of disciplining and war and in general. Yeah? And can you see how that works in this particular case? You know, how that changes the whole idea of what a battlefield is, basically.
Thank you. Yeah, the verticality and the vertical aspects of power in Afghanistan is such an important part of how state and governance was viewed both by Americans and also by the Afghans, Afghan state. The higher ground since the medieval treatises on military has been viewed as something that you should achieve. Every army, when they confront, they have to occupy the high ground. It is something very natural. Even cats likes to be on the high ground to see that their territory. So it has a very long history, and the blimp is just this high-tech version of that medieval perception of power. But in Afghanistan, it was this verticality came because the state and the Americans had no other options. When you have no legitimacy or authority to operate on the land, you have no other option but to go into the sky and practice governance and control of the population through a safe distance. So this is a feature of all contested spaces, not only Afghanistan, and even today that the Americans have left, they are working with Plantir, and they are using satellite images and sometimes drones in order to continue this vertical exercise of power in Afghanistan. So this has been such an important part of the occupation for the past 2 decades. Yeah.
Thank you. Sarah.
Another 2 fingers on this, because it really is a great conversation. I'd like to probe a little bit your use of the word governance and kind of go back to Shah Mahmoud, is that? Shah Mahmoud, sorry. Shah Mahmoud's question about surveillance. Does surveillance equate to governance? Or in fact, are we in a situation where the so-called government has actually abandoned all pretense of governing, and the only governance, quote, service supposedly provided by this verticality is supposedly security, although as you point out, that's not being provided. And the other weird link that this is bringing up in my mind is the vertically integrated corrupt networks. So I didn't go into the kind of discussion of what I mean by integrated networks, but the first type of integration that I started thinking about was vertical integration, again, with no intention of governing, but rather it was extraction of money vertically, the bribes going upwards in the network, in return, again, for security that was, in this case, effective security, not for the population, but for members of the network. So again, I'm kind of playing around here, but with the similar, actually, or a parallel, in fact, lack of focus on governance. None of these structures seem to give a damn about governing. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's so first the relationship between governance and I forgot to press the button. Yeah. So the first the relationship between surveillance and governance. In European languages, to govern means to take care, to provide for. There is a sentence quoted from the 13th century in Foucault. He says that we have enough grain to govern Paris for 2 months. Government to feed Paris, to help, to take care. So there is governance as a combination of care and control. And this we learned during the COVID, the contact tracing, it was surveillance. Day-to-day work of the governance, the census is a form of surveillance, but also it is governance. The state wants to know you in order to help you. At least that's the ideal form. So, that's the pretext. But in Afghanistan, governance, but I mean that the way the state tried to know the population, because it didn't have the capacity and the option to go and have an intimate relationship between individual and the state was very remote. I call it the remote state, and from very far distance, both literally and also metaphorically, because people could not access the ministers, the members of parliament, the president. They were behind barbed wires, these blast walls. The state existed only in this very far distance, and people could see certain signs and representation of it, including in things like the blimp. So yes,
so it's, in a way, it's like extraction of knowledge or extraction of information upwards, sort of like the extraction of money upwards.
Yeah. So another part of governance is delivery of security. Security is a public service. It is like water, electricity, and justice also. So when you are surveilling people non-stop from above, dropping bomb on them, this is a form of public service delivery. In its very literal sense. So when I say that it was vertical governance, it means that the government providing basic services from the air, including security. So that's my view of governance and how it was practiced in Afghanistan by the American military and also by the Afghan state.
Roya and then Sophia.
Just where you left off, Mr. Karimi, thank you for the very rich presentation. So you just said that it was a way of providing security, but I'm curious to know if you are aware of how the existence of this surveillance impacted the Taliban's tactics in the war, knowing that it existed. So they were obviously very much aware of it. Did it have an impact that was useful in terms of that, the conflict, the military conflict on the ground? And how was the receivers of the information were dealing with this phenomena? It was not something covert that was out there, everybody could see it. I mean, you knew that, and you were adjusting, as you alluded in your talk, knowing that you are being watched. So how did it play into this, how they adjusted their tactical war operations? And I have another question. Should I wait, or for Mr. Salim, or everybody, or let
Ask.
ask? Okay. You spoke about how NRF is using literature and language and culture, reinterpretation of Islam and whatnot, of course, as a pillar of a very important pillar of identity. But then at this point in time, how effective this is on the ground, given that we are facing a real crisis. In my view, there is also another war, specifically towards women. And then, while it's very important to work on the revival of the culture and they have debates and discourses and whatnot, is that fueling to more of factionism among diaspora community who are not worried about surviving from today till tomorrow? Or is it really helping in how it will shape things to move through the tragedy that the people in Afghanistan are living in?
Thank you, Ambassador Rahmani, for the great question. So the function of one of the important functions of the blimp was working as a CCTV in the sky. So it is like when a thief enters your shop, you would roll back the video. They would do the same with IED. When there was a bomb explosion, because they had recorded all the video for days, for 30 days. So they would roll back the video to identify who did that. That way they caught a lot of Taliban, and that way they mapped the behavior of the Taliban in each village and each region, what kind of car they drive, who they interacted with, and then they integrated that with cell phone data and other forms of geographical information. This was very effective for the Americans to catch local Taliban operatives on the ground. But some Taliban, because it was very mysterious, the Taliban didn't know that it had this capability. They would shoot at the balloon, and of course it wouldn't work. It just would reveal their positions. But because of the secrecy surrounding the blimp, I think the Taliban were not very good in adjusting their tactics around the surveillance, but the Americans were very good in catching them. So
You think ISI didn't help them?
probably, but I think they didn't target the top commanders, but mostly low-level Taliban operatives.
Thank you very much for that question. I hope the volume is okay. And this is the closest mic that I'm near. It's okay.
Yeah.
So with respect to your question, Ambassador Rahmani, I'd offer the following. I think the framing of your question is problematic because it centers a dichotomy or a binary between the oppression of women and the oppression of the general population in Afghanistan. I don't see the oppression of women as being disconnected or disjoined from the structure, whether it's during the past 20 years or before that, or what's going on right now with respect to the Taliban as being something unique or separate from a worldview and intentionality of the systematization of violence by the Taliban. Now, the reason why language and religion in particular, since I didn't refer to culture in my talk, but culture is naturally related to these two things, is because it's not something that creates schisms or that creates, from my reading and understanding of these texts and content, it's not creating any new schisms. It is highlighting historical issues that have been left unaddressed. And we are at a turning point or a watershed moment in the country wherein the past reflective kind of engagements with various foreign institutions and government, various ideologies have left the country in ruins. We saw what happens with the Americans, we saw what happens with the Soviets, etc. The importance of engaging and revisiting this literary tradition, the importance of revisiting and reinterpreting the religious tradition actually can be very transformative in unifying the country, offering things that are organic, offering things that are rooted in the country, offering things that are already familiar but have been avoided or ignored for a long period of time. So I don't think that it is creating new contestations or new violence. Violence is already at stake. Violence is already occurring. This violence is not simply the removal of women from the workforce. It's not simply denying women access to education. But it's also the extrajudicial killings of the former ANBSF. It's also the violence and the imprisonment and torture of people in Andarab and Badakhshan and Panjshir and Balkh and Herat. We can't separate the violence that is occurring daily against all segments and strata of society in Afghanistan and simply center and say, well, what about women? I think if we do that, we are actually playing into the very schemes and the very cunning approach and politicization of the Taliban and their approach. As soon as they open schools to women, what happens next? What happens to the content that is being instructed and relevant and present in those schools? That's why what I offer from the engagement with this tradition and the engagement from these shifts that are happening, both inside and also outside Afghanistan, both in the diaspora and inside the country, is that the real battle and challenges is one of vision and one of revision, right? What is the vision that the Taliban have? What is the vision that is an alternative to the Taliban, and which can weigh out militarily, psychologically, intellectually, and so forth? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Sophia.
So my question, I'm pushing the button.
Okay.
My question is for Mejgan, but before I ask it, I just want to remind everybody, we really have to work hard to get back into this room at 1:30 because Munasa will be giving her paper through Zoom. She was unable at the last moment, it's a very long story, to leave England. She had a visa challenge. If she'd left, they said she wouldn't be able to get back. So we want to time ourselves to be back in here because she's our first speaker and she's expecting to start at 1:30. But my question is for you. I learned so much this morning. Your paper was, eye-opening. The point that you made that there were traditional songs that were still clearly circulating within Afghanistan, obviously very important. But my question is, are there new songs that are coming out? And I'm asking partially because I've been paying attention to the music, the protest music coming out of Iran, which is circulating on social media. You're seeing it used in a very kind of punky, enough way. And I'm just curious, are there songs like that as well that you've come across?
That's a wonderful question. Oh, pardon me, sorry.
You have to.
Sorry. Oh, okay, sorry. I'm a little technologically, oh, okay. Oh, God. Okay, thank you so much for that question. Funny you should ask. I am working on a new project with my colleague Munaza Iktitar, where we are looking at resistance music being produced since August of 2021. And absolutely, there is resonance across the region and across some of the oppressive environments of the region are being sung by various singers, particularly those from the north. And we are trying to create a catalog of these songs and look at the themes of them. But absolutely, there's resonance between what is happening in Afghanistan in terms of these songs of resistance and what is happening in Iran. Oftentimes, these songs are also recalling that longer past that I spoke about too, where some of the Persian world's most revered poets and their works are being cited again, but as being used in a way to sort of decree these anti-Taliban anthems. And it's very, very interesting. I also want to say that as of late, I mean, since August of 2021, specifically in protests to that moment throughout the world, one song among many, but one of the most popular songs of that moment was a song called My Homeland, Sarzamin Man, by Dawood Sarkhosh, an Hazara Afghan singer. And this song circulated really, really widely and has become sort of another anthem that we see circulating. And it's a cry for peace in the homeland. Thank you so much for the question.
So just as a follow-up though, because I think this is kind of relevant as we zoom out, why would someone like me not know about it, whereas I know the Iranian, I mean, so there is another part of this, which is the ways in which the dissemination of the protests within Afghanistan just don't land. I remember the early days of the sort of social media thing where I think I'm going to misrepresent, it was like, get your laws off my clothes, where it was women posting dress in local regional styles and saying, you know, I don't want the Taliban to change the way I like to wear my, you know, I remember that, and that came across my feeds, but I'm not seeing this. And so do you have any, because I see it from Iran, so there's no reason why I would, you know, like technically, right? So why is that part of the story not going beyond the borders of the, you know, region in the ways we would hope?
And can part of your work on this project be to do so?
Yeah.
Well, I need the help of the media, honestly, to do that. But here's the thing. We see this cycle being repeated again with regards to America's foreign policy interests in the world, and America and its allies not paying attention to what is happening to resist the Taliban. And that is, I think, part of the discussion that we're having here as to why Afghanistan has, you know, particularly in the West, now suddenly sort of become quiet where Afghanistan is concerned, and it doesn't get as much media attention as we hope it will. And specifically, there's not being attention being made towards resistance to the Taliban. I mean, that would be a question that I would love to pose to our symposium here. Why do you all think that is? I mean, I think we've already alluded to why that's the case.
Well, that's a perfect question to take to lunch.
Yeah, great.
Thank you very much.